Hey guys, this is Hemant from Edureka. Today's session is going to be all about AWS versus Microsoft Azure. So we're going to discuss the differences and the things in common between these two cloud providers. So let's move on to today's agenda to see what all we'll be covering today. So we'll start off today's session by discussing the different cloud providers which are out there, followed by the topic of the day, which is AWS versus Azure. Once we're done with that, we'll move on to job trends, wherein we'll be discussing the different jobs, wherein we'll be seeing which cloud provider offers us better jobs. And in the end, we'll be passing the verdict as in which cloud provider is better. All right. So guys, this is our agenda for today. Are we clear with it? All right. So John says yes. Kishore says yes. Dinesh says yes as well. Okay guys, since most of you are clear, let's move on to the cloud providers. So guys, these are basically the top cloud players which are out there in the market. You have Rackspace, you have DigitalOcean, you have IBM Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Join, Telemark, VMware, and obviously AWS. Now among these cloud players, obviously AWS is the leader among these cloud competitors. Now why AWS is the leader? Because it has the largest market share. The second largest market share is held by Microsoft Azure, right? But the difference is huge. If you talk about AWS, so AWS has a market share of 31% as compared to the market share of 11% by Microsoft Azure. But the thing here to note is that there is no cloud provider which lies between these two numbers, that is 31% and 11%. And that is the reason Microsoft Azure is second in place. But why is this number so? So AWS was launched way back in 2006 when there was no cloud competitor. Amazon was the first company to actually step into the cloud computing industry. And that is the reason AWS is way ahead of other cloud providers. If you talk about Microsoft Azure, it was launched in 2010, which is 4 years later than AWS, right? So AWS has a head start, and maybe that is the reason it has a greater market share than other cloud providers. And that is the reason that most of the services in Microsoft Azure are actually, the idea have been taken from AWS, because AWS is already successful. It is the most successful cloud provider. So obviously for reaching to the level of AWS, the cloud provider has to offer similar kind of services, and then once they reach the same level, they can show their innovation as well. So Microsoft Azure offers similar kind of services like AWS. So we'll be looking on to the services in a few moments. So let's see what are the parameters that we'll be discussing today. So these are the domains that we'll be looking today. We'll be differentiating these two cloud providers on the basis of the compute domain, the storage domain. Then we'll also talk about the databases domain. After that, pricing domain. We'll also be looking at the troubleshooting and the monitoring part, the downtime that both of these cloud providers have faced in a year, and in the end we'll also be looking at the difference between the user interface, right? So let's talk about the compute part. So like I said, Microsoft Azure offers similar services as of AWS, and it makes sense because AWS is already successful, right? And to pass AWS or to be as successful as AWS, you should first offer services which are already there in AWS, right? So if you look at EC2, so EC2 is a service which is offered by AWS. So EC2 is basically a service wherein you get raw servers, and these servers can be configured to become a web server. It can be configured to become a worker tier environment. The firewall can be tweaked to your requirements, right? So this is the kind of independence you get when you're using servers on AWS, which is under the EC2 service. Now this idea was taken by Microsoft Azure as well, and they launched a service called virtual machine, which is based on the same idea. So basically if you're using AWS, you're using EC2, and you're planning to make a move to maybe the Azure infrastructure, so you can do that using the virtual machine service, because the idea is same, the ideology is same, the working is same, just the name is different, right? So this is about EC2 and virtual machine. The next service is Elastic Beanstalk, which is a platform as a service wherein you just upload your code. You don't have to manage any server, you don't have to configure your firewall, you just upload your code and your application is automatically deployed, right? So this is the idea that AWS thought of, and they call this service as Elastic Beanstalk. Now Microsoft Azure saw that this idea is again successful, and they also came up with a service called App Service, which is based on the same idea. The next service is AWS Lambda, which is based on the idea of serverless computing. So in serverless computing, you don't have any servers, there are no servers deployed. You just upload your code And also the serverless computing idea is only for background tasks. It is not used to deploy any application as in the case of Elastic Beanstalk. In the case of serverless computing, you execute background tasks, and these background tasks are executed by servers which are not decided by you, but it depends on the workload or on the processing which is required to run your code. So like I was saying, in AWS Lambda, you just upload your code, and based on the workload and based on the processing that your code requires, the servers are deployed, right? If you talk about Microsoft Azure took that idea and launched a service called Functions. So AWS Lambda is actually functions in Microsoft Azure, right? So this is the compute part, guys. Now, like I said, AWS and Microsoft Azure are offering same kind of services. Let's look at them in more detail for the computing part. So any server that you launch in the cloud computing environment is called an instance, right? So if you talk about an AWS instance, so an M3.large AWS instance can be compared with a D2V2 instance in Azure, right? So let's talk about the configuration. So AWS gives you an 8 GB of RAM and 32 GB of storage in an M3.large instance. Similarly, in D2V2 instance, you get 7 GB of RAM and 100 GB of storage. Now AWS is offering more RAM, but in the same instance, in the same class of instance, Azure is offering less RAM but with more storage. And if you look at other instances as well, so if the RAM is more on the Azure side, the storage is more, right? So if you want to compare AWS and Azure, they are comparable because you cannot say that AWS is better in this case and Azure is not, because both are offering similar kind of services. Because if you will pay for more RAM in Azure, you will be paying for more storage in AWS, right? So if you talk about compute domain as a whole, then Azure and AWS emerge as equals, right? Let's move on to the next domain, which is the storage domain. So in storage domain, the first service is in AWS is simple storage service. So simple storage service is based on the idea of object-based file system. So basically you can store any kind of file in this object-based file system. Now the same idea is also implemented in Microsoft Azure as well. It is called blob storage, which is again an object-based file system. And in blob storage as well, you can store any kind of file. The next service is SQS in AWS, which is kind of like a buffer. So SQS is a simple queuing service wherein you queue your tasks, and the servers which are not dependent on SQS. So SQS is an independent service, and servers which are independent again connect with this service to pick up tasks which are to be executed by them. And once a task is done, the task is removed from the queue and the next task is listed, right? So SQS acts basically like a buffer. So this was the idea, and the same was implemented by Microsoft Azure as well, and the service is called Queue Storage. Now if you are a person who has been using AWS and your workload is now something like this, that you want to have backups and you want a disaster recovery for your application, and you plan, okay, if AWS tomorrow experiences a downtime, we should have another service as a standby, and you decide on to go with Microsoft Azure. So if you're using SQS, and you have to decide now which service to use, you'll be using the queue storage, which acts like a same service but just with a different name by a different cloud provider, right? So this is basically the idea. Let's talk about the third service, which is AWS Glacier. So AWS Glacier is basically a backup service used by AWS. So if you have your application in the AWS infrastructure and there is some data that you don't use that much frequently, you can store that data on a cheaper storage device or on a cheaper storage which is offered by AWS Glacier. So if you're using SSDs, which that is solid state drives, and if you compare it with the pricing of magnetic tapes, so magnetic tapes are way cheaper than solid state drives, right? So you can migrate your data that you're not using that much frequently from an SSD to the magnetic tapes, and that is what AWS Glacier is all about. It's a backup service, right? Now the same idea was implemented by Microsoft Azure as well, and they offer a service called backup. So in backup, you do the same thing, infrequently access data, and you store it in a cheaper storage, right? So this was about storage. Let's move on to the next domain, which is databases. In AWS terms, you have a service called RDS. So RDS is basically a relational database service wherein you have databases like MySQL, Oracle, you have databases like MariaDB, which are managed automatically, as in the backups or the updation of the security patches or the updation of the DB engine is all done automatically by a service, and that service is called the relational database service in AWS. Now that same idea was implemented in Microsoft Azure as well, but then this case in the SQL database service, you don't have the option of choosing a database. You have a database called SQL and you have to configure everything in that. You don't have a MySQL or you don't have a MariaDB database, you don't have an Oracle database, you just have SQL, right? So you have to change your application code to meet the requirements of this SQL database which is provided by Microsoft Azure. So basically Microsoft Azure has not reached that level yet. So AWS wins in this case. Let's talk about the next service, which is Redshift. So Redshift is a data warehouse service wherein you do data analytics, right? So you feed in data and you can perform analytics on that. So the same idea was implemented by Microsoft Azure as well, and they offer a service called the SQL Data Warehouse, wherein you get the same functionality, the same idea, but with a different name, right? The third service is DynamoDB. So DynamoDB is again like RDS a managed service, but DynamoDB is used for non-relational databases, right? And the same idea has been implemented by Microsoft Azure as well, and they call their service as DocumentDB. Now let's talk about pricing, which actually makes a difference. In the cloud computing world, actually, you get discounts when you're reserving your servers, when you're reserving your instances, right? So AWS has a scheme wherein you get discounts if you reserve your instances for a particular term. Now this term could be 1 year or 3 years, right? The same idea was also implemented by Microsoft Azure, and that idea is called Microsoft Enterprise Agreements. Right? So you can reserve your instances in Microsoft Azure, and the way you can do that by using the Microsoft Enterprise Agreements, right? The next difference is that you get charged according to the hour when you're using services in AWS. But in Microsoft Azure, they came up with this different method of billing you, which is they charge you according to minutes. So it makes sense for you if this might be useful for you if you're not using your instances for the full hour. Say suppose you don't you use your instance or you launch your server for say only half an hour. So if you do that in the AWS infrastructure, you'll be charged for that whole hour. But if you're using Microsoft Azure, you'll be charged only for those 30 minutes, right? But this won't make sense if you're running your servers for hours. Like in our case, for our company, we are running or we have set up our company's website www.edureka.co on the AWS infrastructure. Now this website is going to be up and running as long as the company is there, right? So for us, maybe the billing in minutes won't make sense as of ours. Now, if you look at this pricing for AWS and Microsoft Azure, and if you convert those minutes into hours of Microsoft Hours billing, AWS is actually more cheaper than Azure because obviously they can afford that because they have a more mature model of infrastructure. But then, like I said, if you have instances which are not running for the whole hour, then Microsoft Azure makes more sense. Let's move on to the next section, which is the troubleshooting and the monitoring part. So if you're using AWS, you have a service called CloudTrail. So CloudTrail is basically a logging service. So any application that you have deployed in AWS and you're making any API calls, those API calls are actually recorded on logs in AWS. So why is it useful? It is useful when you're troubleshooting an application. So say suppose your application experiences a failure. So you have to troubleshoot which part of the application caused the failure, right? And that can be used and that can be done using the logs that are being stored in your AWS infrastructure. And this logging service is called CloudTrail in AWS. But if you compare it with Microsoft Azure, so Azure has a similar service. The service is called Azure Operational Insights, right? So if you want logging service to be implemented in Microsoft Azure, you can do that using the Azure Operational Insights. The next service is CloudWatch. So CloudWatch is a cloud monitoring tool. In cloud monitoring, if you want to monitor your instances, how much traffic, if you want to monitor the traffic which is coming onto your instances in AWS, you would do that using CloudWatch. And similar kind of thing can be done in Microsoft Azure instances as well using the Azure Application Insights. Now guys, if you compare AWS and Azure, AWS actually has a lot more services than Microsoft Azure. But Microsoft Azure, like I said, was launched pretty late than AWS, and it's been trying to catch on to Amazon Web Services. And if you look at the growth rate for Microsoft Azure, it's actually been pretty decent. And the kind of services that they have came up in past 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years is actually commendable, because they have emerged as an underdog to the second most popular cloud provider, which is a great job, right? So that basically means that they are trying to catch up with AWS, and maybe in the next 3 or 4 years or 5 years down the line, they might be able to get in par with AWS. And they might get there by just implementing the same ideas as AWS did, because AWS has already tried and tested each and every service, and they know which services are successful, right? So Azure, if it feels that this service is successful and it needs to be implemented in their infrastructure as well, it can do that. But at one time, when Azure and AWS will come at one stage, then the race actually starts, because then both of them will be doing innovations, and maybe Azure may come up with a service which AWS has not came up with, right? And then maybe Azure may come up with a service that AWS has not come up with yet and become more popular than AWS. AWS offers more services than Microsoft Azure. It is economically more viable than Microsoft Azure in most of the cases, not all the cases, but most of the cases. And that is the reason that AWS is still maintaining the top position in the cloud computing market. But like I said, this is not permanent. It is not what it is going to be for the next 5 or 10 years, because Azure is continuously growing. It is continuously expanding, and it is growing more closer to AWS year by year, right? Moving ahead, let's talk about the uptime. So if you are a customer and you have to choose between AWS and Microsoft Azure, you'd be using this parameter, right? So let's talk about AWS. So AWS in 2016 experienced 108 minutes of downtime. On the other hand, Azure experienced 270 minutes of downtime in the year 2016. Now this could be because of various reasons. Now AWS has 16 different regions across the globe. Now Azure claims that it has around 30 plus regions around the globe, and because of these many regions, which is obviously more than AWS, their logic is also right, that because the number of regions has increased, their downtime probability has become more, and that's why they have more duration for their downtime. The other reason for this could be that AWS has a more mature model of infrastructure. Now, like I said, AWS was launched way back in 2006. So they have more mature model of infrastructure, as in they've experienced more scenarios wherein they've suffered power outages, and maybe they came up with a mitigation strategy, or they came up with the strategy to avoid that kind of power outage. So Microsoft Azure is still a new player in the market, and it is not that much equipped as AWS is, right? And that is the reason that maybe it is experiencing more downtime. But then if you look at AWS, so AWS has 6 times the server capacity of all of its competitors combined, which means you take into account the servers of Microsoft Azure, you take into account the servers of IBM Cloud, you take into account each and every cloud provider which is competing with AWS. You combine the servers, still AWS would have 6 times the server capacity than all of these servers combined. And after that, they have only 108 minutes of downtime in a year, which is commendable. Now, like I said, it could be because AWS has more experience in the cloud computing domain. And maybe Azure in the coming years would catch up onto that. But then 108 minutes for these many servers is commendable, guys. And that is the reason why AWS is more preferred by customers when they want to deploy their application on cloud infrastructure. So they prefer more AWS than Microsoft Azure. Next up, we have the user interface. So this is actually not a parameter that you can differentiate on, but then it is just to give you a feel of how an AWS dashboard will look and how a Microsoft Azure dashboard will look. So as you can see from the dashboard, AWS has a white bluish theme kind of dashboard, wherein Microsoft Azure has a premium kind of feeling. They have a black kind of dashboard. So let me give you a live example for both of them. So this is the dashboard, guys, for AWS. So all the services that are provided by AWS are listed over here. So you click on that service and you can deploy that service. Now comparing this with the Azure dashboard, so this is how Azure dashboard looks like. So if you want to launch an EC2 service or you want to launch virtual machines, you can do that by clicking on virtual machines and launching that. So you have all the services listed under Microsoft Azure over here. You click on the service and you can actually launch that, right? So this is how the dashboard for Microsoft Azure looks, and this is how the dashboard for AWS looks, right? So coming back, so this was just to give you a feel of the difference between Azure dashboard and the AWS dashboard. Guys, let's move on to our next section, which discusses the job trends. So we can clearly see that AWS is more widely adopted in the cloud computing market than Azure as of now, and hence more of AWS experts is needed in the industry, right? And that is the reason you have more job postings for an AWS solution architect as compared to an Azure solutions architect. So the blue line is the Azure solutions architect job postings, and the orange line is the AWS solutions architect job posting. So if you talk about you, so you are a person who wants to make a move to the cloud industry, right? And since you want to make a move to the cloud industry, obviously you choose a cloud provider who has more job postings, right? So you have a better chance over there. So clearly AWS wins in the job trend scene as well. But like I said, that does not mean that Microsoft Azure does not have any career scope. It does have scope as well because like I said, its growth rate is phenomenal. It's been growing each and every year, and it's been improving each and every year because, for example, it experienced 270 minutes of downtime in 2016. In 2015, it had around 2 or 3 times of this downtime it has reduced in the year 2016. So like I said, it's growing each and every year. It's been improving itself. It's been matching itself to the standards of AWS. And maybe in the next 3 or 4 years, it will surpass AWS. But if you take the current scene, AWS is way ahead from Azure. AWS has more jobs than Azure. And hence, that is the reason that you guys are learning AWS today, right? But like I said, you don't know the future, right? So if you are done with learning AWS, the safest bet would be to learn Microsoft Azure because every company has to has a failover, right? So if AWS experiences the downtime, they need their application to be hosted on some other cloud provider as well so that they can switch on to the secondary cloud provider. So as of now, your Microsoft Azure can act as your secondary cloud provider, right? And it makes sense to learn about Microsoft Azure as well. So based on our discussions, if I ask you the question, who wins Battle of the Clouds, AWS or Microsoft Azure? It is difficult to say because like I said, Microsoft Azure is growing at a very fast rate and maybe in the coming years it will come in par with AWS, right? But if we take the current scene, then AWS has an upper hand because it has more number of services than Microsoft Azure. At the same time, it has a more mature model of infrastructure and hence it gives less of downtime per year, right? So, but this is all achievable. This can all be achieved by Microsoft Azure in the coming years. It may even surpass AWS for that matter, right? So it is very difficult to say who wins. So if you ask me that which cloud provider I should go for, I'd say it depends on your usage. Because if I'm a company and I'm using AWS, migrating altogether to a new cloud provider will cost me a lot. And that is the reason AWS still has a larger market share because it came in the time when no cloud provider was out there, like in 2006, right? So it could be a reason because if I was on AWS and now I have an option between Microsoft Azure and AWS, I'd stick on to AWS when the prices are same. Because first of all, migrating all of my applications to a new infrastructure will cost me a lot because I have to change the underlying code because the infrastructures are different, right? So that's why people stick on to AWS. First reason. Second reason people stick to AWS is because it is an old service. It has that trust in people because it's been there since 2006, like I said, and it's been dealing with cloud computing since that time. Microsoft Azure, on the other hand, is a new player, and hence it will take time for people to migrate to Microsoft Azure. Now, I'm not saying that people are not there in Microsoft Azure. If you look at the companies, people are still using Microsoft Azure, but most of the customers for Microsoft Azure are there on AWS as well because their primary application is on AWS, and what if the AWS infrastructure fails? There should be a backup, right? So there comes Microsoft Azure. So you have Microsoft Azure there in the scene as well, all right? So we cannot say which cloud provider is winning. Like I said, if we take the current scene, then AWS has an upper hand. Alright? So this is the difference between AWS and Microsoft Azure. Now let's go on and see what are the differences between launching an instance between AWS and launching an instance in Microsoft Azure, right? So what we're going to do is, first we're going to launch an EC2 instance in the AWS environment, an Ubuntu AWS instance, right? And the same case, we're going to launch a VM. A VM is basically an EC2 in AWS, right? So both services are practically the same. So we're going to launch a VM in Microsoft Azure, a Ubuntu VM in Microsoft Azure, and then we're going to compare both these environments. What are the difference between launching an instance between both these environments, right? So this is what we're going to do. So let's go to our browser and launch our AWS instance first. So guys, this is your AWS dashboard. So what we have to do is we have to launch an EC2 instance. So let's do that. We'll click on EC2 under the compute section. So guys, this is the EC2 dashboard. Now as you can see, there are two running instances as of now. So we'll click here and we'll click on launch an instance. Now we have to launch an Ubuntu instance, right? So we'll select the Ubuntu instance. I think the t2.micro should suffice. So we'll click on configure instance details. Nothing else has to be configured. You just leave everything at blank. We'll straight away go to the review and launch this instance, right? So now you have to choose a key pair, right? So what we'll do is we'll create a new key pair and name it as Edureka_C, right? So we'll download the key pair and we'll save it on desktop. So we have the key pair downloaded now. We'll click on launch instances. So my instance is now initiating. Let's go and see it in the EC2 dashboard. Now as you can see, there are 3 running instances now. So we'll go here. And as you can see, there's a new instance being initialized, right? So this is our instance. Let me give you a quick recap what we did. We went into the EC2 dashboard. We selected the Ubuntu AMI or the Ubuntu type of instance. And then we selected the configuration for our system. And then we left everything at default and we launched that instance, right? So this is the way to launch an EC2 instance in AWS. Now the difference when you launch an instance in your Microsoft Azure is that first of all this service, this same exact service is called a VM in Microsoft Azure. Second of all, as you saw that you were supposed to choose a key pair, right? So in Microsoft Azure you have an option for that. So you can either choose a password or you can choose a key pair. So if you choose a key pair, Microsoft Azure automatically doesn't allocate you a key pair. What it does is it gives you the option to create your own key, right? So what you can do is you can go to putty-gen, create a new key, copy that RSA code over there, and then when you're trying to connect it through your putty software, because Ubuntu can only be connected through an SSH connection. You don't have any GUI in Ubuntu, right? So when you'll be connecting through the SSH, you'll be uploading that private key over there, and you'll be copying the public IP address from Microsoft Azure dashboard, and you're set. You'll be getting connected to Microsoft Azure. So the only difference that you have between your Azure and your AWS is that the key pair is automatically allocated in case of AWS, and in Microsoft Azure you have to specially enter that. And if you don't want to do that, you can simply set a password, right? So it is still initializing, so let's wait. Okay, so while this is initializing, let us launch the instance in Microsoft Azure as well, right? So, and since we have to launch a compute instance, we'll click on compute. And since we have to launch Ubuntu server, we'll click on Ubuntu. Right, so now we'll click on create. And now we have to set the basics. So the name of this instance could be Azure Ubuntu. A volume type should be SSD, that is fine. Now you have to set the username as well. Now in case of your AWS, you didn't have to set any username because the username is set by default. What is that username? I'll tell you while we connect. For this you have to set a username. So let's set a username as Azure Ubuntu again, right? Then like I told you guys, you have an option between a password kind of authentication and then the SSH public key. So if you go for the public key, you have to create your own key. So what you have to do if you want to create your own key is that there's a software called PuttyGen. So you'll run that software, right? And you'll click on generate a public private key pair. And then you have to drag your mouse over there so that for randomness, and then you'll get a key over here, right? Now you'll have to copy whatever is there in this dialog box, copy this and paste it over here, right? This is it, nothing more. Once you do that, you have to select your subscription. So the subscription could be a free trial. If yours is a new account, you can go for free trial, but ours is a paid account, so we'll go on pays as you go. Alright, now the resource group, click on create new and name the resource group as Azure Ubuntu again, right? Now the location could be anywhere, right? So since we are in India, we've selected South India. Now we'll click on OK. Now what kind of configuration do you want, right? So you can choose the configuration as per your need. Since ours is a demo, so we'll select the minimum configuration that we can get. So this is the recommended configuration. For viewing all the configurations, we'll click on view all. And now since ours is a demo, we'll select the cheapest instance. So this is D1. So it has 1 core and 2 GB of memory. Right, so this should suffice. Let's click on select now. Alright, so you'll review everything and you'll click on OK. So my instance is now being created, right? So this will take time. Going back to the PuttyGen, you have uploaded the public key over here, but now you have to save the private key as well, right? So you'll click on save private key and you'll name this file something. So let's name it as Edureka _D, right? And we'll save it on desktop, save. Alright, so now when I have to connect to this instance, what I'll be doing is I'll be uploading that private file on the Putty software, uploading the public IP address, and that is it, nothing more needed. So since this may take time to launch, let's go back to our AWS dashboard and check if our instance is running. So yes, my instance has finished being created. So let's connect to this now. So now I'll have to copy the IP address. So I'll copy the address from here and then launch Putty software for creating an SSH connection. So this is my Putty software, guys. Over here I'll be pasting the IP address of my AWS instance. Once I've done that, I'll go to SSH and click on authentication, and then it'll ask me for the private key, right? Now guys, in case of AWS, since your private key is auto-generated, that private key is in the form of a PEM file. It is of the extension PEM. But with Putty, the only extension that works is PPK, right? So now you have to convert your PEM file into PPK. So let's do that. So we'll click on PuttyGen. So for that, again, PuttyGen can be used. We'll click on load. We'll go to desktop. Ours is Edureka _C, right? Click on all files and select Edureka _C from here. Alright, so this is the file that we created. We'll click on open. It says it has successfully imported the key. Click on OK and then click on save private key, right? Now you name this file as Edureka _C and then it will automatically save it as PPK. Click on save. Okay, so my file has now been saved. Now again, I'll just recap what I did in my Putty software. So over here I pasted the IP address. This is the main page, guys. Once you open Putty, you'll reach this page. So you'll be copying the IP address here and then you'll be going into SSH and then click on authentication. You'll reach this page. Click on browse and go to the key that you just created. So it is Edureka _C, right? So this is the PPK file. I'll click on open. Click on yes. So now you'll be asked the username, right? So any Ubuntu instance that you launch on AWS, its default username is Ubuntu. So what we're going to do is we're going to write Ubuntu over here and then hit enter. So it will authenticate you with your public key and then yes. So now you have successfully entered and accessed your Ubuntu instance. in AWS. So guys, this is the way you access your Ubuntu instance in AWS. Now let's see how you can do that in case of Azure. So let's exit this session now, right? This was AWS. Now we'll go to our Azure machine. So this is my Azure dashboard and my IP address is this, right? So let's just copy this IP address and launch a putty software, paste the IP address here, click on SSH, click on authentication. Same procedure guys, no difference. But in our Azure case, we already have a PPK file because we created the key ourselves, right? So we'll go to the key that we just created. So it is Edureka_D, if you guys remember. We'll click on open and again click on open. Click on yes. Now it is asking me the username, right? So in case of AWS, by default you have the username as Ubuntu, but if you guys remember when we were launching the Azure instance, it asked us for the username. So we enter the username as Azure-Ubuntu, right? So we'll hit enter. So yes. So now we have accessed the Ubuntu machine in the Azure environment. So guys, the only difference, like I said, between accessing the machine in case of Azure and accessing your machine in case of AWS is that in case of AWS, firstly, your default username is Ubuntu, and in case of Azure, you get an option to choose your own username, right? In case of AWS, you are provided with the key automatically, and that is you don't have to create your own key. But in case of Azure, you have to create your own key and then upload it to Microsoft Azure dashboard, right? So these are the differences guys. So let's go back to our slide. So we have successfully launched an EC2 instance in AWS and a VM instance in Microsoft Azure. Both of them were Ubuntu. Both of them we created an SSH connection using the putty software, right? So guys, this brings us to the end of our session. Any questions are welcome. Anything that you want to ask, you can type in the chat window and I'll be happy to answer it. Alright, so everyone is clear then? Okay guys, so let me wrap up this session. So thank you guys for attending today's session. I hope you learned something new today. Whatever we have practiced today, I suggest you guys that you should practice it once on your own as well. It seems simple, but you might learn something new when you're doing something on your own, right? So please practice it on your own machine as well. And the assignments have been uploaded to your LMS. And the next session, you would be expected to upload your assignments for correction. And this is it guys. So any kind of questions that you have, you can always contact our support team. It is available 24/7, and in case the support team is not able to help you, I'm always there. So you have my email ID in your LMS. You can email me whatever your query is and I'll be answering it whenever I have time, right? Okay, so that's it guys. So see you in the next session. Goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries and we will reply to them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to our Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!